My paper today is called Dialogue di Morte, Yodfat contre Massada. According to Josephus's autofiction known as the Jewish War, right? I think this is the biggest innovation of my reading practice on Josephus, is I refer to the text, the Jewish War, as autofiction. Like Knaus, my struggle. On July 27th, AD 67, in the second bloodiest battle of the Jewish revolt, the Roman army, led by Vespasian and his son Titus, both soon to be emperors, broke through the defenses of the Galilean hilltop fortress town Yodfat and destroyed 40,000 Jewish defenders, many of them having committed suicide at the prospect of being killed or captured by the Romans. The general of the Judean army of the Galil and Golan, one Yosef ben Matityahu, that is Josephus himself, escaped to a cave with some 40 other prominent citizens of the town, and then he was on the point of surrendering to Nicanor. But when the Jews who had shared his refuge realized that he was yielding to the invitation, they crowded around him shouting, "Well might the laws of our fathers groan aloud, and God himself hide his face for sorrow. God who endowed Jews with spirits that despise death. Is life so dear to you, Josephus, that you can bear to live as a slave? How quickly you have forgotten yourself. How many have you persuaded to lay down their lives for liberty? Utterly false, then, was your reputation for bravery and your reputation for shrewdness, if you can hope to be spared by those whom you have fought so bitterly, or even supposing that they grant you a pardon if you lower yourself to accept it. No, if the fortune of the Romans has made you forget yourself, the honor of our country devolves on us. We will lend you a right hand and a sword. If you die willingly, you will have died as general of the Jews. If unwillingly, as a traitor." Ben Matityahu had written for himself and allegedly delivered at this point a very eloquent speech arguing that it would be evil and wrong for them to kill themselves. Now, the translation should begin. At the very end of the speech that Josephus contrived for Josephus, right? Josephus is the author, Josephus is the character. Arguing brilliantly against suicide at Yodfat, Josephus the author, produced the following moving and confusing utterance. "Yet if you do not look on these, the city and the temple, with affection, at least pity your families, and let each man set before his eyes his children, wife, and parents, so soon to perish by famine or by war. I know that I have a mother, a wife, a family of good birth, and an ancient and illustrious house involved in these perils, and perhaps you think it is for their sake I am offering you advice. Kill them. Take my blood as the price of your own salvation. I, too, am ready to die if that will lead you to learn wisdom." Unpacking this final move in Josephus' speech, extolling submission and not violent resistance, in which he offers death of his own and that of his family to persuade others not to die or sacrifice their families, will be my opening gambit in this talk, right? Now, I just say a few words extempore, so I will say them in English, and maybe if someone can, who knows English well, can translate them into French for the rest of the audience. My innovation in the study of Josephus is that where other scholars have seen him as split between loyalty to the Jews and loyalty to the Romans, or between loyalty to Torah, Jewish culture, and some kind of cosmopolitanism, I see him as split in an entirely different way between what is worth dying for and what we must not die for. And that is the argument that I am going to make, right? So if within this very paragraph, he both is asking the people not to commit suicide and saying, in order to persuade you not to commit suicide, I will commit suicide with my family, we see in dramatic form that this is the question, right? This shifts the whole perspective on Josephus. The questions are existential and profound. What must we die for, and what must we live for and not die for? Should anyone translate that quickly for everybody understood? Good. In my opinion, my experience is that if you speak loudly enough and emphatically enough, everyone understands what you are saying, whatever language it is. So, in my opinion, historian Steve Mason is absolutely correct in his determination that we cannot read a single and consistent ideology out of Josephus's writings. They are frequently and sometimes explicitly dialogical in nature as well as being plainly and evidently self-contradictory at many moments, at many crucial moments. The latest trend, for instance, in Platonic scholarship demands that we don't claim that this one or that one, Socrates or someone else in the dialogues, is speaking for Plato, but that we recognize all the characters of the dialogues as in some important fashion speaking for Plato. Just as now many psychologists deem all the characters of a dreamer as the dreamer. I propose the same way of reading Josephus, even in matters literally about life and death. My suggestion is that both sides of a dialogue can be read as both reflecting different voices within Josephus, and thus a way of exploring his deeply ambivalent emotions and commitments. In this lecture, I will explore in more detail some of Josephus's most poignant inner conflicts, namely the question of the value of death for the cause of eleutheria, freedom, and especially the very question of suicide. Now, one of the most influential antique texts in contemplation of death, and especially self-sought death, is Plato's dialogue on the death of Socrates, the Phaedo. Even though Plato's Socrates, convicted and executed for impiety, was thought of by his followers as an exemplar of the willed, chosen death, the martyr, literally witness par excellence, Plato has his Socrates, in the moments before his death, argues strenuously against self-killing as impiety, but he declares this in highly paradoxical fashion. After some conversation about why Socrates has turned to writing poetry at the advent of his death, Socrates tells his friend Cebes, "So tell Evenus that Cebes, tell him that Cebes, and bid him farewell, and tell him, if he is wise, to come after me as quickly as he can. I, it seems, am going today, for that is the order of the Athenians." And Simmias said, "What a message that is, Socrates, for Evenus. I have met him often, and from what I have seen of him, I should say that he will not take your advice in the least, if he can help it." Right? So one gets to know quite a bit about Evenus. I think he had a lot of joie de vivre, shall we say. The simple meaning of this demand on his colleague would seem to be surely that Evenus, the poet, ought to seek to join Socrates in the land of the dead as soon as possible. In other words, that he should kill himself. Simmias, another of Socrates' companions in death row, finds it highly unlikely, knowing their friend Evenus well, that he will kill himself. Socrates has an answer, albeit a very sophisticated, perhaps even sophistic one. "Why so?" said he. "Is not Evenus a philosopher?" "I think so," said Simmias. "Then Evenus will take my advice, and so will every man who has any worthy interest in philosophy. Perhaps, however, he will not take his own life, for they say that that is not permitted." Cebes, now quite naturally, asked Socrates, "What do you mean by this, Socrates, that it is not permitted to take one's life, but that the philosopher would desire to follow after the dying?" Right? It seems to be a bit of a contradiction there. "Why in the world do they say that it is not permitted to kill oneself?" Socrates says. He says, "I heard Philolaus, when he was living in our city, say the same thing you just said. And I have heard it from others too, that one must not do this. But I never heard anyone say anything definite about it." Socrates' rejoinder to this question provides us with the real paradox at the heart of the matter. "You must have courage," said he, "and perhaps you might hear something. But perhaps it will seem strange to you that this alone of all laws is without exception, and it never happens to mankind as in other matters, that only at some times and for some persons it is better to die than to live. And it will perhaps seem strange to you that these human beings for whom it is better to die cannot without impiety do good to themselves," right, by killing themselves, "but must wait for some other benefactor." And Cebes, smiling gently, said, "God knows it does," speaking in his own dialect. Right? We can imagine Cebes sort of muttering something in Ionian dialect or something, not sure he wants Socrates to understand, so he said it in Yiddish, something like this. "In all other matters but this is my language, one is enjoined to make the better decision, and every other matter has exceptions for cause, except this one. The prohibition of suicide is absolute, according to this text, even in cases in which it is obvious that for the person in that situation, death is preferable, better than life. Thus, even the philosopher preferring death to life must await his divine benefactor or one of God's agents to cause him to die. He cannot, that is, may not, take matters into his own hands, It is indeed a paradox and a very strange doctrine. Socrates begins his answer to Kebes' puzzlement. It would seem unreasonable if put in this way, said Socrates, but perhaps there is some reason in it. Now, the doctrine that is taught in secret about this matter, that we men are in a kind of prison, our bodies, and must not set ourselves free or run away, seems to me to be weighty and not easy to understand. But this at least, Kebes, I do believe is sound, that the gods are our guardians and that we men are one of the chattels of the gods. So do you not believe this? Yes, said Kebes, I do. And the conclusion follows quickly. Then take your own case. If one of your possessions were to destroy itself without intimation from you that you wanted it to die, wouldn't you be angry with it and punish it if you had any means to do so? Certainly. Quod est demonstratum, or as we say in Talmudic, Shma Mina, learn from this. Josephus was familiar with the Phaedo, and thus with this passage. He alludes to the Phaedo in many places. It is not at all surprising, then, that his own dialogue on this topic reverberates with the sounds of Socrates. So the next paragraphs are called Josephus's internal dialogue on suicide. I propose at this point to read Josephus's own speech at Yodfat, not as a sermon or diatribe against suicide, but as a dialogue, not unlike in form and content to Plato's, which, while strongly tending towards sharp opposition to self-sought death, nonetheless presents the other side, as it were, in the form of a dialogical encounter. Now, a colleague who read this paper just last night suggested that I add a few words at this point. I will do so slowly. Many of you in this room are aware that ancient historians do not quote speeches for the characters. They invent them, right? They invent the speeches. Thucydides says so explicitly. I write what Pericles should have said on this occasion, or something of that sort, right? So that is what justifies my reading of these speeches which Josephus has invented for his characters as reflecting his own thoughts. Now, according to Josephus, the Romans, upon breaching the walls of Yodfat, remembered what the siege had cost them and showed neither mercy or pity for the defenders. Many of Josephus' soldiers killed themselves rather than let the Romans kill them. Vespasian, again according to Josephus, organized a manhunt for him, for Josephus, believing if they could take Josephus, the war was, for all intents and purposes, over. Right? We understand that. The Russians apparently are trying to kill Zelensky now. Meanwhile, Josephus found a hiding place in a cave with 40 other persons of importance. On the third day, he was caught following a betrayal of his hiding place, and Vespasian offered him safe conduct. Josephus feared to come out, expecting that some sort of trick was afoot, and that he would be very sorely punished for his heroic deeds. Vespasian sent a close friend of Josephus's, one Nicanor, to persuade him to surrender by arguing for the mercy of the Romans towards the vanquished. Perhaps observing that mercy had already led to the killing of several decades of thousands of the Judean defenders. Josephus yet hesitated. In spite of Nicanor's assurances, Josephus still hesitated. Meanwhile, the soldiers in their fury attempted to set fire to the cave, but were restrained by their commander, who was eager to take him alive, Josephus alive. Josephus continues to hesitate, but finally is on the point of surrendering to Nicanor's blandishments, especially as he remembers that he had been informed in a dream to prefer that course. However, his fellows in the cave, getting wind of his intentions, crowded around him shouting, and now I am quoting, "Well might the laws of our fathers groan aloud, and God himself hide his face for sorrow, God who endowed us with spirits that despise death." At the end of their speech, they pointed their swords at him and threatened to run him through if he surrendered to the Romans. It is quite astonishing that Josephus proceeds to tell us the reactions of his fellow survivors hiding in the cave. Why would Josephus put in the incredibly harsh criticisms of him by his fellow Jews? Why indeed? On the reading I offer here, this is the very crux of the question and the fulcrum of an answer. For I want to suggest that Josephus's presentation here is not of a sermon nor a diatribe, but a dialogue which presents both sides in Platonic style, and both are voices within him, contending for in his emotions and his intellect. It is at this moment that Josephus launches into his alleged dissertation against suicide, which I will presently read as a dialogue inspired at least in part by the Phaedo. I will lay out the themes of the dialogue in the order we encounter them. Josephus's own discourse labels this extended utterance as philosophizing, philosophuin, in Greek, which I make so bold to suggest is precisely an allusion, if not homage, to Plato's practice as sketched in all but too briefly above. Note that Josephus's speech, and this is Josephus like this, the character, is essentially composed of defenses against attacks on him leveled by his fellow refugees in the cave, one of whom says that Josephus is a changed man, presumably implying that he no longer holds to the values that he championed until now. Josephus cites the accusations against him for preferring life to death, and at any rate for abhorring suicide. Some say you are a changed man, to which Josephus replies, the Romans know about that, right? You see, he writes of himself in the third person as Josephus. Right? Another says it is an honorable thing to die in war, to which Josephus retorts, quite so, but by the laws of war, namely by the hand of the conqueror, it would be folly to inflict on ourselves the treatment which we want to prevent by our quarrel with the enemy. In other words, we're trying to keep ourselves from dying by fighting with the enemy, so it would be idiotic to kill ourselves in order not to die fighting with the enemy. Another says, it is honorable to die for freedom. I say so too, but on condition that one dies fighting and at the hand of those who are trying to rob us of our freedom. But now they are neither coming to fight us nor to kill us. It is equally cowardly not to want to die when one is caught as to wish to die when one ought not. What prevents us from surrendering to the Romans? Is it not fear of death? And shall we then inflict certain death because we fear possible death at the hand of our enemies? End quote. The next move in this dialogue is the crucial one, or so I suggest. It begins to set up the major thrust of Josephus' argument, so like that of the Phaedo, that we do not belong to ourselves, but to others, or to an other. No, it is fear of slavery, someone will say, but it may be said, we must be slaves, as though we are free men now. It may also be said that it is a manly act for one to kill himself. No, certainly, but a most unmanly one, as I should deem that pilot to be an arrant coward who out of fear of a storm should sink his ship of his own accord. Josephus proceeds to another argument, a sort of recapitulation of the point just made, but with a further fillip, invoking the behavior of all animals. Now, self-murder is a crime most remote from the common nature of all animals, and a real act of impiety against God, who created us. Nor indeed is there any animal that dies by its own contrivance, or by its own means. That, by the way, is wrong. There are animals that kill themselves exactly when all hope is lost. Scorpions, for one, will commit suicide when a group of boys are in a circle around them, making fires or something of that sort. For the desire of life is a law engraven in the hearts of all, on which account we deem those that openly take it away from us to be our enemies, and those that do it by treachery are punished for so doing. And do not you think that God is very angry when a man treats his gift with contempt? For from him it is that we have received our being, and we ought to leave it to his disposal to take that being away from us. Right? We see it's practically a quotation from the Plato. The soul is, after all, a deposit. The bodies of all men are mortal and have been fashioned out of perishable matter. The soul is immortal forever, a fragment of God indwelling in our bodies. If a man destroys something entrusted to him by another man or misuses it, he is judged a faithless rogue, is he not? Then if a man throws away what God has entrusted to his personal keeping, does he think the one he has wronged is unaware? To punish runaway slaves is considered right, even if the masters they are leaving are rogues. If we ourselves run away from the best of masters, God, shall we not be judged impious? It is considered right, Josephus argues, to punish a fugitive slave, even if the master he is fleeing is a rogue. Shall we fly from the best of masters, from God himself, and not be deemed impious? Notice here that the ideal that Josephus presents is not one of living as a free person under one's own sovereignty and self-determination, but as a subject under and at the behest of a master, on the model of slave and master. Moreover, just as Socrates closes his peroration, as we have seen above, with an invocation of the propriety of punishment for suicides as the thieves or runaway slaves, then take your own case. If one of your possessions were to destroy itself without intimation from you that you wanted it to die, wouldn't you be angry with it and punish it if you had any means to do that? So Josephus at the end of the just cited paragraph. Although by no means identical in the presentation of its argument to those of the Platonic text, Josephus elaborates far more. The essential themes of the argument against suicide are very close, involving primarily the figure of the human as not belonging to themselves, the soul being on loan, as it were, to a body, the final clincher, in my opinion, of this connection is the following. Plato's Socrates goes on to state that one of the reasons he can face death without flinching is the existence of another life where he will be with good men and supreme divine masters. Just so, Josephus goes on to argue that obedience and patient suffering will be rewarded in heaven and rebelliousness in hell. One would surely be entitled to think on the basis of this oration that Josephus is implacably averse to suicide for any reason, just as Socrates has declared himself to be in the Phaedo, which certainly would support his self-exoneration in the matter of his own escape, Josephus's, right? If he is implacably opposed to suicide, then it makes sense that he escaped. I continue to insist that there is no evidence of chicanery on his part, even so. Matters, however, are not so simple. First of all, the dialogical form with people shouting challenges to Josephus's position and he answering them interrupts the ideologically simplex character of the speech, as does the allusion to the dialogical Phaedo. It has, moreover, been pointed out that the Phaedo itself has been taken both as against suicide and in favor of suicide within its transmission, and is indeed ambiguous. If all speakers in that dialogue are Plato, then all the speakers in Josephus's dialogue are also voices within Josephus, the author. Secondly, as has been noted by scholars before, especially Mason, not only does Josephus compose an eloquent and moving speech for Eleazar at Massada, which we will see presently, he does so in passionate defense of suicide. And once again, as in Phaedo and in Josephus at Yodfat, in contemplation of an escapable death. Right? So he makes the exact opposite argument. You'll hear that in a minute. We move on then to Massada, in some ways a very doublet of Yodfat. All is lost there militarily too. Josephus's great antagonist and leader of the mostly despised Sicarii, Eleazar, is arguing strongly for suicide as the most desirable of actions, most desirable end, rather than being captured. Josephus ought to be implacably opposed to this move, but seemingly cannot help but admire for the nonce that leader and be moved, almost thrilled, at the prospect of this massacre of wives and children and deaths of the men by their own hands. And the brigand of Galilee is remembered for good. It is important to note at the outset that Eleazar's speech is in fact divided into two speeches, one on freedom leading to death versus submission leading to continued life, and a second one on the preferability of death to life. It is the first speech of Eleazar, the give me eleuteria or give me death. Non-Americans perhaps will not recognize that allusion. The patriot Patrick Henry during the revolution against England in 1776 said, give me liberty or give me death. So, one that will concern me here. For here there is a definite contradiction to be found between it and Josephus's own speech at Yodfat, and indeed to Socrates' arguments against suicide in the Phaedo. Again, my postulate is that Josephus would not have invented and composed such a brilliant speech in favor of dying for freedom had he not experienced at least some of the emotional appeal of Eleazar his own creature's position. Just to give an analogy, although Shylock is clearly the villain of The Merchant of Venice, it is hard to imagine Shakespeare composing the so-moving speech in defense of the Jews' shared humanity. Hath not a Jew eyes? Had he, Shakespeare, not felt the call, at least, of that cri de coeur? It is, however, Eleazar's first speech that provides the most direct contradiction to Josephus's absolute rejection of suicide at Yodfat. Here we go, Eleazar's speech. At this crisis, we must not disgrace ourselves. Up till now, we have never submitted to slavery, even if it involved no danger. In choosing slavery now, we would deliberately accept the horrible penalties that await us if we fall alive into Roman hands. For as we were the first of all to revolt, so we are the last to fight against them. Moreover, I think it is God who has granted us this privilege, that it is in our power to die bravely in freedom, unlike others who were unexpectedly defeated. It is evident that tomorrow we will be captured, but we are free to choose an honorable death together with those we love most. There is no question but that this declaration by Eleazar stands in direct opposition to the total rejection of suicide for any case, as we have seen in Josephus's Yodfat speech. And moreover, the second speech that Josephus gives to Eleazar, while replete with Hellenistic topoi in consolation in the face of death, as shown by Luz, also manifests Josephian wonder at, and even approval of Eleazar's encouragement of the Sicari left at Massada to kill themselves, including even the encomium to the Indian philosophers who burned themselves to death. Moreover, he has Eleazar alluding to the disasters that have faced the Judean temple with their freedom lost and the temple in flames, declare, which of us, realizing all these facts, could bear to face the sun, even if he could live free from danger? Who can be such an enemy of his own country, so unmanly and so fond of life, as not to be sorry he is still alive today? Come, while our hands are free to hold the swords, let them do a noble service. Let us die before we become slaves under our enemies, and leave this life together as free men with our children and wives. This is what our traditions ordain. It is Josephus himself who has composed of whole cloth this incredibly eloquent indictment of Josephus, as it were, right? So he writes this accusation, which is such a compelling one, against himself, so to speak, right? Who ought to be sorry that he is alive if not Josephus? Josephus certainly does not accept this charge quite, but he allows it to be sounded powerfully. Josephus even has the chutzpah here, that's northeastern dialogue of French, right? From Poland, chutzpah. Yes, do you know this word? I hope so, chutzpah. Gaul, right? Not from Gaul. No. Okay. But he allows it to be sounded, but he allows it to be sounded. Josephus, right, even as the chutzpah here to allow, or rather to inspire Eleazar to claim that such noble death is in accord with the traditions of the Jews. As La Douceur has well put it, quote, he was not dealing here with a sacred text, but with the alleged words of an archenemy, one of the revolutionaries whose actions he does not even pretend to represent sine ira et studio. No more, it seems, is the soul in the body on loan, or even a deposit from its true owner, God, and may not be disposed of without his action. It is not easy to account for such an apparent change of heart in Josephus. Mason's judgment that this shows that Josephus is not an ideologue seems correct to me, but not sufficient as an explanation. We can hazard a deeper look into the complexities of the Josephian psyche, remembering always that the best we can do is hazard enticing guesses that do not contradict at least the available evidence. A recent article rejects the possibility of such an imagined look into Josephus' psyche out of hand. This is the article, the language of the article. While these parallels are illuminating, the Bellum, that is the Jewish war, nonetheless should not be viewed as a mere patchwork of topoi stitched together in a vacuum. Apart from its avowed purpose of deterring revolt, it contains personal apologetics deliberately composed by a man whose own actions were hardly above criticism. When the choice of suicide or surrender confronted Josephus as commander at Yodfat, he chose surrender. Elazar at Massada chooses death. The purposes of the war, Josephus' own contrary actions in the war, and the Roman atmosphere in which he was writing all render improbable the supposition that the Jew would have actually wished Elazar portrayed as a noble and heroic barbarian, a sort of Vercingetorix. Now, despite Leduceur's considered opinion, I propose that the last rejected option is precisely a most attractive explanation, however, with an amendment. Josephus, I propose, is portraying Elazar as a noble and heroic figure here, but not to please the Romans or to follow Roman fashion. And this is perhaps the key moment in my new evaluation of Josephus in this book. Rather to please himself, as it were. He is portraying not the enemy of the Romans as such a figure, but his own opponent and enemy. Josephus seems capable, as I am suggesting throughout this book, of both detesting the Sicarii, the radical revolutionaries, and slipping, as it were, into an admiring mode when he is moved to do so. It is Josephus's affective ambivalence that provides the explanation, in my view, and none of the other explanations that have been offered so far. In support of this suggestion, I tender the aforementioned admiration on the part of Josephus of the last of the Sicarii dying a noble death in Alexandria, despite the evident total lostness of their cause. It must be said that a frequently idiosyncratic but very learned scholar, Solomon Zeitlin, put us on the path of this connection, noting, as have other scholars, that Josephus deeply contradicts himself between his own speech at Yodfat and Elazar's speech at Massada. He also provides an appealing to me explanation, which I will nonetheless amend seriously. I have shown elsewhere that Josephus's wonted despisal of the Zealots and the Sicarii is variously directly contradicted by moments in which we perceive him showering these very figures with admiration. One such moment is his moving description of the deaths of the last remnants of the Sicarii, who had sought refuge in Alexandria in Egypt. These, not content to have escaped and saved themselves, wish only to provoke the large and established Judean politeuma in that city to revolt and acknowledge that God was their only sovereign, not Rome. When some of the prominent Jews opposed them, they were murdered, while the rest were constantly urged to revolt. These Sikari, which by the way means the dagger men, the knife men, continued their violence against less radical Judeans, as they had done in Jerusalem, even unto murdering them. Observing their madness, says Josephus, the leaders of the Council of Elders decided that it was no longer safe to overlook what was going on. They summoned all the Jews to a general assembly and exposed the madness of the Sikari, proving them to have been the cause of all the troubles. And they are seeking to involve in the disaster that they brought upon themselves those that have no share in their crimes. The warnings of the Council of Elders take effect, and the community in general captures the 600 Sikari among them, even returning to Alexandria those who had escaped to other parts of Egypt, and even as far as Thebes. Up until here, Josephus has himself spoken with the voice of that council of elders, of madness, crimes, disasters, troubles. But then suddenly, almost shockingly, he changes his tune. I quote again, "Everyone admired the fortitude, and call it what you will, desperation or strength of purpose they displayed, when they were subjected to every form of torture and bodily laceration, only to force them to acknowledge Caesar as master. Not a man gave in, nor came even near to uttering it, but all were triumphant over the pressure and maintained their determination. It seemed as if their bodies met torture and fire without pain, their souls almost exulting in it. But nothing amazed the spectators as much as the behavior of young children, none of whom could be forced to call Caesar Lord. This indeed is how their brave spirit prevailed over the weakness of their bodies." And Josephus, right? So these are the people that he has been damning and calling madmen and violators of God's law and disgusting, and right? And all of a sudden, he is so full of admiration for precisely the same actions that he was condemning. Right? The shift in affect is, as I've said, striking and startling. At one moment, these very people are characterized by madness, mayhem, and their desire to bring destruction on the whole people. And at the next, not only are their suicidal intentions and actions exalted, but a source of great inspiration to the very onlookers, who had been the case of the unspeakable pain of these same, who had been the cause of the unspeakable pain of these same thugs and ruffians of a moment ago. Right? So first you turn them into the Romans and say, kill them, and then you're filled with admiration. Zeitlin, in case you are feeling somewhat tortured, I have one more page. So, Zeitlin boldly connects the two moments in Josephus of this seeming gross inconsistency. Quote, "It was probably the courageous deaths of the Sikari for their principles in Alexandria that inspired Josephus to put into the mouth of Eleazar, the leader of the Sikari in Massada, the exalted speech appealing for suicide rather than submission to the Romans," end quote. Although impossible to sustain as a causal explanation for an alleged shift of values in Josephus, this construction nicely draws together the parameters of Josephus's self-contradiction on both matters, his ability to admire his enemies' fortitude at the moment of their demise in Egypt, and their leader's bold call for suicide at Massada, both in direct contradiction of Josephus's passionate speeches against such violence and such suicide at other junctures. Rather, however, than seeing the real-world events as inspiring Josephus. We're talking about 2 chapters in a book that was written 20 years or 10 years after the events. So it's impossible to argue that he changed his mind because of an event that took place, right? And therefore contradicted himself. You see what I'm saying? Right. So it's him writing both chapters, and therefore I am arguing that this is a split within him, and not something that changed him. So I would hypothesize that his conflicted ideation and emotions are expressed congruently in both subgenres, the historical narrative and the invented speeches. Given that the war was not written as the events were happening, it is impossible, pace Zeitlin, to imagine events in one chapter inspiring a change of heart in Josephus when he writes another chapter only slightly later, or even, it seems, earlier, as it appears in the book, and in both cases sitting in Rome well after all the events. While to be sure it cannot in any case be proven, the hypothesis offered here of Josephian inner conflict or ambivalence seems a highly attractive one. He is fundamentally and in principle deeply opposed to suicide and suicidal actions and campaigns, but can't himself but admire and be drawn to the bravery of some of his most antipathetic antagonists, those very knifers of Jews who opposed them, an opposition of which Josephus himself surely would have been a cadre of those who opposed the Sicari. No simple ideologue indeed, but a passionately divided soul, our Josephus. Thank you.
ליל שימורים, אותו אל חצה כחצות לילה בתוך מצרים כיצא. גיבור על אדום יחצנו כחצה. דוד מעריב ערב ונזמרנו בנפש חפצה. La nuit de Pesah, Dieu la veut partir. Les Mitzrim tués